I'm just a sinking ship, and you're just a pair of lips that I've lost in the moment. All I want is for you to come back. Now I'm caught in the middle of life, and I need you to survive.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host and your friend, Rashid. And without further ado, I'd like to bring on Professor Helmer. I'm trying not to say sir. I'm trying not to call him. And he's laughing behind the scenes, so I have to bring him on real quick. Let's see. I'm trying a new. Hold on, everybody. I'm trying a new. Maximize. Let's see. Okay, you should be on the screen. All right. So here we are. How's it going today, Professor?
Thank you very much, Rashid. Well, as I explained to you off air, yes, I earned the rank of professor, but I never use it unless I'm in court facing people who insist on their rank, or unless I'm at the doctor's and being presented with an invoice. At that point, yep, I use that rank. But on your podcast, on doing journalism, there are a lot of folks walking around who haven't earned the title professor. One of them's rather well known in China. I don't think it's an appropriate title. It doesn't earn credibility. It's what the facts tell you, what our audience can do to assemble what we're trying to interpret here. And for that purpose, Professor ex-CIA analyst, former White House staff member, colonel, major, retired, none of that stuff is worth reciting. But let's get to the facts, let's get to the evidence, and let's get to your questions, Rashid. Glad to help.
So what is going on now? We see, well, first let's go to Russia, because there's a lot going on in Russia. Russia just issued a directive to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians started firing drones around Russia. They haven't hit Moscow, but they have been hitting different areas. Where is this taking us?
Well, I think it's best not to exaggerate. It's best not to misrepresent. The fact of the matter is that the Ukraine war is at a stage that's comfortable for the Zelensky regime, bearing in mind that that regime will sacrifice an unlimited number of Ukrainian people in the pursuit and the continuation in permanent war against Russia. Permanent war against Russia, sacrificing all of the Iranian people, so to speak, is also the policy of remilitarizing Germany, rearming but politically weakening Great Britain, politically weakening and rearming France and the rest of the European countries, including those along the northern front, so from Poland, the Baltic states, up to Finland. These states are committed to a policy of long-term permanent war against Russia. And the success of their campaign, which is backed by the United States, is to continue to show that they can continue attacking in a certain sense wherever they choose, which is as deep into Russia as they can, as their drones have the range to reach. Second, to attack Russian oil infrastructure, both in ports in the south, terminals in the north, and so forth. To attack symbolic targets like the strategic bomber fleet, which they attacked last year, the Capitol building in the Kremlin, which was attacked more than a year ago, a symbolic attack or a significant attack on the victory parade in Moscow in Red Square on May 9, tomorrow, your time, would be a demonstration of their ability to continue the war. The security measures to prevent such an attack are extremely tight, and to reduce the amount of target available, as well as to achieve other things, the Russian side has decided not to parade military equipment and to shorten the parade so as to limit the availability of the targets. On top of that, as we've seen, the president's spokesman, Yuri Ushakov, and others have warned that if the Ukraine does that, Russia is prepared to attack the center of Kiev. And to make that threat credible, the Russian side has warned the European powers to evacuate their embassies. To that, the European powers, starting with Chancellor Merz of Germany, have reacted contemptuously and dismissively. They're prepared to accept the risk. Now, the question then becomes operationally, does Russia have the capability to strike? Yes, it does. In escalation, it could use, as many podcasters have suggested, the Oreshnik, which cannot be defended against, cannot be intercepted, cannot be blocked by any form of air defense supplied to the Ukrainians by the United States or the other NATO allies. The demonstration effect of the Oreshnik has already been shown on President Putin's orders in a strike on Dmitry Petrovsk last year. And there's been operational deployment of that weapon in Belarus, as well as in Russia's regular forces. What's the point of threatening to use such a weapon against downtown Kiev now? Who does it deter? That's a good question. It doesn't deter the NATO powers, bearing in mind the way I began. The NATO powers, including the United States and the Zelensky regime, are determined to fight to the last Ukrainian. The loss of lives has been a sacrifice they're more than willing to pay to continue this war against Russia. Killing people doesn't deter the adversaries in this case. So using an Oreshnik against central Kiev will not change the balance of power in this war. It won't. Why? Because the Zelensky regime will survive. A lot of people will not survive. And it's conceivable that a number of Europeans will be killed. A number of Europeans, foreign mercenaries from Poland, France, you name it, every country in Europe as well as in Asia and the Americas, those individuals have been killed on the battlefield. Significant targeting of French regular forces, British special forces, missile and drone guidance units. They've all been targeted. They've all been killed. They've all been destroyed without any impact on deterring the continuation of the war. On the other hand, when Russia draws red lines, as President Putin has been drawing red lines for many years now to deter NATO from advancing eastwards, from deterring NATO to deploy its nuclear-capable missile systems in Romania and in Poland, all of those red lines have been crossed, and therefore the process of Russian threat has been undermined. Therefore, it's no longer appropriate in a war that Russia faces that's permanent on the part of the adversary, and is willing to sacrifice any number of individuals on the adversary's side. It's purposeless to say, here's a red line. It's purposeless operationally and strategically to threaten that if you do this, we will do that, in the expectation that that's a deterrent, because it isn't a deterrent, and that's proved. Therefore, one has to ask, why does Mr. Ushakov issue a threat of that kind? Why have we reached a point where it continues to be necessary to talk instead of fight?
Thank you, M Sparks, for the $5 super chat. Really appreciate it. I wanted to ask you, along the lines of what we're talking about, haven't the Russian leadership backed themselves into this position because of the many times of letting the West escalate without a major response back? Because whenever the West hits you, they never call it an escalation. Whether it's Iran, whether it's Somalia, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Palestine, whether it's Venezuela or Cuba, or whatever. But when there's a response, they call that escalation. They frame your response as an act of escalation, as if you're supposed to allow them to rape, pillage, and murder you without any legal right or freedom to defend your life. So hasn't the leadership of Russia allowing NATO and the United States to infringe upon an ex-Soviet state after ex-Soviet state, to ignore Russia's national interest, one interest after another, to then openly get involved and say, job is to have you strategically defeated, and we are going to supply this weapon to Ukraine. We're going to fund Ukraine, and Russia does nothing but allow that to happen and say, well, we'll keep the battle in Ukraine, instead of reaching out and touching the people, the very people who are funding the war, instead of blaming all of it on the Ukrainians?
The way the question answers it, but we are best to answer it from my side if we talk about domestic Russian politics. And you spoke of Russian leadership. What's that? On the one hand, we have the intelligence services and the foreign ministry, and what appears to be a majority of the Security Council, representing all elements of the national security decision-making groups in Russia, chaired by the president, and meeting, roughly speaking, once a week. The consensus of that group is not different from what you've just said. And publicly, the spokesman for that line, let's call it, that argument, that strategic vision, that analysis of what's lost, what's gained from not responding with asymmetrical force, not responding so as to concede escalation control to your wartime adversary. The spokesman for what you've expressed correctly, Rashid, is the former president Dmitry Medvedev, whose record as a president was not the record he makes as a spokesman now. Now he's a succession candidate, and he's reflecting, let's call it, I'm reluctant to use hawks and doves. It's a complete waste of labels and time. Let's just say the line of maximum effective deterrence against permanent war against Russia is expressed by Medvedev and almost certainly held as a consensus in the Security Council and backed up publicly by the Russian Foreign Ministry. On the other hand, we have a different factional lineup. That's represented by domestic economic forces led by the controlling economic groups known as the Russian oligarchs. They have long dominated economic policy, domestic policy, from the beginning of President Putin's term. The effective US sanctions, of European sanctions on them, allegedly to deter them from assisting and advising President Putin, the effect of those sanctions has been to force them to repatriate their capital, and which is a line they were not willing to take when President Putin invited them to, pressured them to do that. Now, the oligarch line is represented publicly by the president's special emissary appointed February 2025 for negotiations with foreign governments, but in fact is the special emissary for negotiating with Trump, President Donald Trump, his associates and family. That's Kirill Dmitriev. Kirill Dmitriev was born in the Ukraine, was educated from high school through university in the United States, has been an employee of major US financial corporations, and is the most pro-American individual in what you could call the Russian leadership. Dmitriev's line, which has been endorsed by President Putin, and that's not nothing. Dmitriev's line is expressed every day in a blizzard of tweets which he issues. He also has been meeting this year, as disclosed, approximately once a month since last December in the United States with Stephen Witkoff, with Jared Kushner, with the US Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, and others. His mission is to persuade the United States and the Trump administration by economic inducement, by money, by bribery, that Russia and the United States can, if together combining their economic resources, if Russia concedes significant economic concessions, commercial concessions, money concessions to US corporations, then Russia can achieve terms of relief from the permanent war. But then Dmitriev represents the line. The US does not represent permanent war threat to Russia. He's mistaken, but strategically, operationally, tactically, he's mistaken in fact, but however, in politics, he's powerful. He's so powerful, a source of mine has described him to me as Putin's whisperer. Now, what does he whisper? I can tell you. He did it himself 24 hours ago when he posted a tweet that shows the Soviet red flag painted over the red flag, painted over the European Union flag with the European Union stars on the red flag, waving in with a text to illustrate the text that Dmitriev is attacking the European, what he called the Bolsheviks in Brussels, and the leftist European bureaucracy. He's attacking them, associating them with Russian history as the enemy of Russia. Now, he does that on the eve of May 9, Victory Day. He does it to insult one of the most important symbols of Russian Soviet resistance to war against Russia. He does it to insult the red flag of the Russian and Soviet army and their achievement in defending not only Russia, of course, but all of Europe, the United States, and the rest of the world from fascism. In Russia, that particular tweet and its meaning from Dmitriev is a crime. It's a criminal offense to manipulate the history of Russia in a way that insults, distorts, and transforms for propagandist reasons the history of Russian defense of its existence. It's a criminal offense, and prosecutors around the country have been prosecuting individuals for that kind of offense. But Dmitriev is the president's whisperer. Okay, so what does it mean? It means that Dmitriev represents a faction influentially close to the president within the Kremlin that talks not only monthly with Witkoff, Kushner, Besant, and others, but speaks possibly every week on the telephone and electronically, as does Ushakov, which was revealed by some transcribed tapes of Ushakov's conversations on a Yuri and Steve basis with Witkoff, whose authenticity has never been denied. There is therefore a faction that not only denies the consensus, the strategic consensus of the other part of the leadership, but actively aims to subvert that consensus and destroy the capability of the presidency of Russia to defend the country and to work out how best to deter the US and its allies from this permanent war. So what do we have here? We have a political conflict inside the Kremlin, around the Kremlin wall, in Moscow and Russian politics, in which we have an individual who's more pro-American in the sense I've just explained is characteristic of Dmitriev, than any other member of President Putin's advisory group, supported by the economic power of the oligarchs and endorsed and backed by the policies of the Russian Central Bank, whose governor, Elvira Nabiullina, is also supported by President Putin. So what do we have as a result? A significant, increasingly loud and clear debate in Russia that's critical of that group, and no outcome yet. What we do have, however, is growing domestic political stress, wherein potential recession territory, statistically speaking, minus 1.8% GDP for January and February, investments being crushed, all sorts of enterprises bankrupt, banks increasingly reporting losses in the first quarter. We have signs of stress. These are not war caused. They are not triggered by any of the sanctions measures. They are triggered directly by the central bank's high interest rate policy, which is almost universally condemned around the country in the public and in the State Duma. Since we have a parliamentary election, the Russian equivalent of the midterms coming up on September 25, we have increasing disapproval of President Putin's performance personally. It's not my opinion. It's in the polls that are obvious. It's in the media, which are obvious. This is not war caused. It's caused directly by the policies of the central bank, endorsed by President Putin, and implemented on the foreign level by Dmitriev. So you have a combination of, let's say, elements, economic, commercial, banking, and Dmitriev, which represents the antithesis, the opposition, the contradiction of everything that you said as a beginning would make sense from a Russian strategic point of view. And that's why we have President Putin acting in such a way as to leave the questions open. How can the president of Russia fail to acknowledge the obvious here? Answer. He continues to endorse the idea, Dmitriev's idea, that there was an agreement with President Trump at Anchorage, Alaska, an understanding, a formula known now in Russian political chatter as the Anchorage formula, and that it's the best way of reaching an end of war on the Ukraine battlefield, is to continue to appease, ingratiate, negotiate with President Trump and his men. That's Witkoff, Kushner, Ascent, Rubio, and others, on the lines of the Anchorage formula. Problem? No one else believes the Anchorage formula has been endorsed by, consistently held by, at the present accepted by anyone in the Trump regime. What's more, the Iran war shows that you can't negotiate with Witkoff and Kushner in good faith. It's not possible. However, as I've just put up as a tweet, the president's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has just publicly endorsed the so-called Anchorage formula and President Trump and Witkoff and Kushner for their goodwill, and indicates that Russia looks forward to their continuing service in their negotiations. Peskov is the spokesman for the president. He's just endorsed the goodwill of two men who've proved in the Gaza negotiations, who've proved in the Iran war negotiations to be utterly untrustworthy. So there you have it.
So how long can this go on? First of all, I want to say to those who are listening, you have to bear with us. The Panhandle where I'm at right now is being hit by multiple severe storms. We're under multiple tornado warnings, so it may be freezing and stuff like that. So I just wanted you to understand that for those of you who are watching right now, it's out of my control. John already knew about it. That's why we had to push the show back some, because the internet was off for a day or whatever. So I just want to inform you about that. But John, going back to Russia, because we'll switch to Iran in a few minutes. But going back to Russia now, if these people are as wise as they're supposed to be in leadership, and even Sergei Lavrov has said that the U.S. is agreement incapable, and multiple people in the leadership have said this. I know that there has always been a group of people who want to be accepted by the West, but they have to be in the Security Council to discuss these issues that America uses economic leverage to get into your nation, so that she can then overthrow your leadership, or that she can manipulate your economies and stuff to her benefit. And I know Demetrius, even though he was raised in Western schooling, is he ignoring the fact that the American economy is going down the drain, and anything that hitches its back to that economy will be going down the drain with it? He's so much in love with the Western world and has been brainwashed so much by the Western world that he's willing to take his people down the rabbit hole of collapse?
Well, that's a question for him. All I can reply is that he speaks for himself with a daily tweet or two or three or half a dozen. First, Second, there's nothing exceptional about Kirill Dmitriev. Russia has had an entire decade of individuals of that kind selling out Russia, the economy, the welfare of Russian people, and the longevity of Russian people for the breakup of the Russian Federation. A decade was called the Yeltsin administration. It was produced by the means which were far from constitutional, far from legal, and far from clear, even now, that brought Boris Yeltsin to power and then installed a group of individuals as pro-American in the sense we're using it, as Dmitriev. Their names begin with Anatoly Chubais, who directed Yeltsin's privatization campaign and created, through selling off, the word sale is a bit of an inappropriate one, giving away the national capital, putting it in the hands of a group of oligarchs in return for their protection and financial support of Yeltsin's elections. Anatoly Chubais was the beginning of exactly the process that you've mentioned. He's still alive. He's now under constant prosecution in Russia for massive embezzlement. His assets have been sequestered, and he's to keep his freedom in Israel. There have been others, if you trace the associations and political history, from Chubais to Alexei Kudrin. Alexei Kudrin's protege was the current central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina, and many others. It's a history of 10 years of near total destruction of Russia. The reason President Putin has maintained such high level of popularity and public approval is that he's done a good job of reviving and restoring Russia domestically from the destruction achieved by Chubais and his gang over those years, basically 1991 to 2000. Since then, however, that system of oligarch domination has matured in various ways, assisted by the president's decision making. And I've spent all these years, whatever they are now, since 1989, reporting on the way in which the oligarchs did their business in each of their sectors, and the way they accumulated the power that they exercised, and the way that political power was used. So it's a very long story, can't be summed up in a few words. But I am summing it up to answer your question, how does an individual like that continue to operate politically as effectively as he says he does? Because he's had a history since the year 1991. His predecessors, almost all of them survived, none of them in jail, none of them actually prosecuted. Chubais is investigated, but not yet prosecuted, not yet put on trial. And the likelihood is he never will be. And he certainly won't return from safe haven in Israel to face accountability for what he as an individual did. Okay, that's the backstory, you might say.
Okay, since we're talking about Israel, this is pertaining to Russia, but it's leading us into the Israeli-Palestinian-Iranian conflict. Now, a huge portion of Israeli citizens are Russian, of Russian origin, and we see that that Israel has a large hold or stranglehold on a lot of American foreign policy. So knowing that, and we see how America continues to go after Russia. They went through Syria. They went in Iraq. They went to Libya. They've overthrown. They're trying to put pressure on Cuba. They've overthrown the leadership in Venezuela, and now they're after Iran, and they're squeezing into the former Soviet republics in Central Asia. Why is Russia ignoring the hand that Israel is playing in it? Because remember, when Georgia attacked Russia, attacked the Russian peacekeepers, they were being advised by Israeli security officials, and they were armed by U.S., Israeli, and NATO forces. So why is Russia allowing and wanting to be accepted by the West so much, and also ignoring what part Israel is playing in this aggressive policy to colonize and then force Russia into capitulation and then ultimately balkanization? Why are the Russian leaders ignoring that?
Again, we're speaking of factional politics. As we speak, it's now front page reporting in the Moscow papers that Israel, the Israeli government, that's the Netanyahu regime, has rejected a vessel from unloading Russian grain purchased by Israel. And the reason they've rejected the cargo and sent the bulk carrier away is that Kiev has warned Israel not to accept Russian grain on the spurious grounds that some of that grain may have been grown in the 4 regions of the eastern Ukraine, which are now part of the Russian Federation. The grain may have, or some parts of the cargo may have been grown, says the Zelensky regime, in the Donbass. The Israeli regime has done what the Zelensky regime told it to do and rejected the Russian cargo. It has imposed a sanction on the Russian cargo in accordance with a Ukrainian diktat. Doesn't that convince the Russian leadership, so to speak, that Israel is a hostile state? Doesn't that say the Russian citizen population of Israel, I'm not sure what the numbers are, but among 7 million Jewish citizens of Israel, I think up to about 2 million have been Russian origin or Russian speaking, or are Russian speaking. They came to Israel in repudiating the Soviet Union. They came to Israel largely as a result of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment in the United States Congress, which in return for improvement in US-Russia-Soviet economic trade, led to the release of Soviet Jewry, which wanted to emigrate. And many of them went to Israel, many to the United States, many all over the world. That Jewish population is hostile, was hostile then to the Soviet Union, was hostile to the leadership of Russia then. Now, President Putin has repeatedly said that Russia owes a national responsibility to its compatriots in Israel. President Putin does not explain why Russia, as a state and as a policy and as a strategy, owes anything to those former members of the Soviet Union who repudiated everything that Russia has stood for then and now. What we have, in fact, is a particular long-standing personal philo-Semitism, particular support for Israel on the part of President Putin himself. This is widely acknowledged. He doesn't himself discuss it. However, what you've said, Rashid, accurately describes the way in which the current Israeli regime acts as a proxy for the United States and with its own expansionist policies and ambitions in the Middle East in such directions that directly conflict with Russian policy, as you said, in Syria, in Libya, in the Mediterranean, and now, of course, against Russia's strategic partner, Iran. What you will find is President Putin personally, it's personal with him, supports the Israeli regime in the first round of Israeli war against Iran last year. President Putin telephoned Prime Minister Netanyahu. He did not, in the Kremlin readout, express Russia's opposition to Israel's war against Iran. Instead, he asked Netanyahu not to attack the Bushehr nuclear reactor and endanger the lives of several hundred Russian experts and technicians working in that civilian nuclear power facility. Imagine that. The president of Russia rings the attacker of the first wave of war against Iran and says, don't attack my people in Bushehr. He hasn't telephoned Netanyahu this time round, and the Israelis and the United States have both attacked Bushehr, but the Russian side has largely evacuated its technicians from that facility. So what I think the best answer I can give to your question, Rashid, is that on present Israeli policy, there is no justification for President Putin's view that he needs to maintain some form of balance towards Israel on account of the Russian-speaking, Russian origin Israeli community in that country. And he never has explained why he supports that notion of responsibility to those, as it were, political exiles and opponents of Russia in the past, why he owes them any more responsibility on national solidarity when they don't reciprocate. Why does he owe them any more than the Soviet regime owed the white refugees as they spread out across the world after the fall of Tsarism and after they fought the Bolshevik regime as the whites and lost. They lost the Civil War. The Russian origin Israelis are the whites of today. And it's yet to be said in the Kremlin what responsibility, national or otherwise, cultural or otherwise, does the Russian policy of defending Russia and its allies have to a group of Israeli whites?
Yeah, and I think what's more is this. They need to seriously consider this, that America is not going to stop what she's doing. She is going for broke because she understands that the empire needs more debt, needs more collateral to finance that debt, needs to expand the empire constantly because it is a paradox. And in this can also be said of the UK, and this can also be said of Israel, and this is why you see all three of those in wars together, and this is why you see the Greater Israel Plan, and this is why you saw the Balfour Declaration and the so-called British mandate to take Palestine and give it to Qazaris. But what I'm saying is this: we see a war going on in Iran right now, or in West Asia right now, and this war is not specifically in Iran, even though Iran is fighting this war. This war that is going on is for the U.S. to maintain hegemonic supremacy, and that means, to a certain extent, the British, who hold some sway, and that also means the Israelis or the Jews who hold influence in America, and they are using what they want is Iran to be to capitulate and to be brought to yield, so that they can then use that as the underbelly to go into Russia and China to encircle both of them, to break both of them down and prevent either one from Russia from emerging as a re-emerging as a superpower, and China from emerging as the preeminent superpower. So, do you think that they are having these types of discussions because America will not stop, and we know that the Jewish oligarchy will not stop either?
You make important points there, Rashid. I'm glad you did. You make the point front and center that we are dealing with a clash of empires, and we are dealing with the politics of resistance to empire. The initial reason that Stalin supported the creation of the State of Israel, as he did, was that he and the Soviet Politburo at the time, in the late 1940s, coming out of World War II, believed that Israel represented as a Jewish state, inheriting the territory, as you put it, of the British Empire's Balfour Declaration. Stalin believed it would be anti-imperial. It would be let's call it a wedge against the British Empire, the French Empire, and the building US Empire in the Middle East. That particular calculation motivated Soviet recognition, early diplomatic recognition of the Jewish state. Subsequently, it's been a political line in the later Soviet policymaking, in the Politburo of Leonid Brezhnev and others, that it was a strategic objective of the Soviet policy to deter the US from imperial adventures against Soviet interests, and to mitigate anti-Soviet sentiment in Washington. The calculation that always then was, pretty much as you said it, Rashid, that there was a very strong Jewish lobby in Washington, a pro-Israel Jewish lobby, and that if the Soviet Union cultivated the Jewish lobby, it would be enhancing Soviet influence to counteract other US imperial decision-making adverse to the Soviet Union. That was the calculation, strategically speaking, politically speaking, that motivated the Jackson-Vanik Amendment that I've just described. Now, both those calculations, political strategies, if you like, are no longer appropriate. Israel is no longer anti-colonial. It's part of the US hegemon, the US empire, and it has imperial ambitions of its own. And it has the military capabilities, it thinks, to enforce that territorial expansion and that imperial doctrine. That we don't need to go into that much, but if our audience wants to go back to johnhelmer.net and put in any search word on US empire, Israel empire, and you'll find the evidence the calculations that have existed in Moscow, in the Kremlin, since Stalin recognized a Jewish and Palestinian state, those calculations have all become obsolete. And exactly as you said, Rashid, Russia now finds itself fighting the hegemon, just as China does, just as Iran does, just as Cuba does, just as Venezuela once did, once upon a time. So, in this new situation strategically, and it's new, the role of Jewish influence in Washington is transformed. Witkoff and Kushner and Gruenbaum and others are Jewish supporters of the Israeli genocide in Gaza. They've facilitated it. They've attempted now to enrich themselves as well as the United States in the redevelopment of Gaza under the so-called Board of Peace. They are advocates of the destruction, if necessary to genocide, of Iran. This is part of, and I don't need to repeat, there is obviously a leftover group in Moscow who thinks that the Jewish influence in the United States and the Jewish doctrine in the Middle East is something Russia can accommodate. Well, not in any empire fighting strategy that I can imagine, and not in any, and I can't think of any historical precedent in which that calculation continues to be true or advisable. So I guess it's a long-winded way of me saying one can explain why Russian strategy was the way it was. One cannot see any reason for it to continue. Political reasons I've just explained. And Dmitriev, so far as I know, is not Jewish. He has no sentimental attachment or cultural attachment to Israel. In fact, he totally ignores the Jewish wars. He totally ignores the Gaza genocide, the Iran war. His preoccupation, his priority for Russian strategy now is to align economically, commercially with the Trump family and its associates. So that's where we are now. Israel has just rejected a Russian grain cargo on Zelensky's dictation. There's no longer, and there can be no longer any date that as a state, Israel is hostile to Russia. And there is no longer any justification for believing that the Jewish lobby in Washington are in any way positive towards Russia, in any way less committed to permanent war against Russia. That's our situation. It's transformed. No point in living in the past.
So where do you think all of this is leading in West Asia? Because again, as I said, America is not giving up. I always use these terms when dealing with America. The 3 R's of empire: rest, rearm, recalibrate. She was taking a beating. She didn't accomplish any of her goals that she set out. Israel was taking a beating both times. They didn't accomplish any of their goals, and then every time they're losing or they're in a frenzy, they want to stop and have some type of break in the fighting so that they can rest, rearm, and recalibrate their positions. We see that with Ukraine, and we see that in the war between the U.S., the U.K., Israel, and Iran. Where is this leading us? Because sooner or later, it's going to escalate. You cannot continue to slap a person. You cannot continue to ignore a person's bounds. You cannot continue to ignore a person's security, their family security, their resources, and think that will not be a response. My mom used to always say that sometimes You can kick a dog 99 times because it's a lazy dog, but you may kick it that 100th time and the dog will get up and bite the crap out of you. So we may be approaching that inflection point, John, because think about this. Why would any sane person want to attach themselves economically to a failing empire, which is it's clear to see 39 trillion in debt. They're saying that the United States is going to spend at least another $2 trillion dollars in debt, and they're not even talking about the war expenditures. There was a professor from Columbia that said in I believe it was 2014, that the United States true debt at that time was $222 trillion in debt. And he put all the mathematical numbers and everything up. He showed, because he used to be in government, and he did a budget work. And then we see the congressional budget officers saying that America is on an unsustainable path. We see that she has a lower tax base, so she's not a manufacturing power. She's a service economy. And we're seeing this. How can a rational, sane person want to hook their economy in their nation with a dollar with no stable backing, and an economy that is going down the drain faster than water?
Well, I too served for 4 years in the United States Office of Management and Budget. And I can tell you that I don't. It's a political conviction. It's a expression of hope that the US empire is collapsing soon, tomorrow, or even in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes. Such an empire is not going to collapse overnight. And that's not the Black community, the resisting communities of the United States have to fight to protect themselves in the oppressive conditions in which the Trump regime now is attempting to disenfranchise them everywhere in order to preserve Trump succession forever. And that's a war inside the United States, and that's not quite what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is war outside the United States, led by the Trump regime at the moment. And what we're seeing that's new is the capacity of a relatively small non-empire state, Iran. That state is showing how to resist, how to fight back, and fundamentally how to deter by inflicting a level of cost and pain on their attackers, which they can't bear. They can't bear because they can't continue to hold political power at home under the pressures and the costs that Iran is demonstrating. Iran is the first case I can think of in the Middle East in which one of the smaller powers has demonstrated the capacity to inflict on Israel and inflict on the Arab sheikhs, and then on the imperial master, the United States and its navies and its forces, a level of counterforce they can't sustain over a long period of time. Of course, Iran is paying a terrible, protracted price in blood, human loss, and economic loss. But in capturing control of the Hormuz, Iran is using its mastery of drone warfare, drone boats, drone aircraft, to enforce a level of pain on the rest of the world, including the United States, which obliges the rest of the world essentially to back off. Now, that's an illustration not of in my view, the conclusion there is not that the US empire is collapsing, but it's being forced to go elsewhere for its adventures, for its expansion to the Americas, for example, where it's been more successful operationally. Iran is showing how a small regional power can defend itself. I wrote a book about the collapse of, the destruction of Arab nationalism. The secular Arab national leaders from Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, through the Syrian Assad family, the Iraqi leadership of Saddam Hussein, and the Libyan leadership of Muammar Gaddafi. We don't need to rehearse that they're all dead. The book documents how it was achieved by the US over, in league with Israel, but let's not overestimate the Israeli effect. The US intention was always, from the beginning of US power in the Middle East in the 1940s, was always to establish US imperial control. The Arab secular power, they've succeeded. They have not succeeded against Iran. They are failing against Iran. Conclusion, look to the lessons Iran as a small resistor teaches militarily, economically, in negotiations. Don't come to the conclusion that the empire is collapsing. That won't happen soon. But Iran is happening now. The example of resistance to empire is happening now. The conclusion, the collapse of the empire, not happening now.
I have a somewhat different opinion on that. I believe that Iran, the reason we can look to Iran right now is because of the economic and political chaos that is happening within America itself, and also because of the geography of Iran. Because if Iran were not placed where it was geographically, it would not have the Strait of Hormuz as its ultimate weapon to hold against the United States. And remember, if America's economy was still humming and her debt situation was not as great as it was, then she would be able to endure more and do more against Iran, even with the Strait of Hormuz. So we're seeing not just Iran limiting America's scope of power, but I would say that the empire has been collapsing over time. She defaulted on her debt in the 30s. Even though people don't like to say it, when they revalued gold, she quietly started defaulting on her debt in the 50s and the 60s, when she started robbing the coins of the silver. And when it got to the 70s, when she robbed all of the coins, the half dollars, the dollars, and everything else of the silver, then she started printing up more money, and Richard Nixon was hearing whispers from around the world, from not only his enemies but allies like Charles de Gaulle, saying that, hey, America money printing and spending is far beyond the goal that she has. So Richard Nixon says, hey, America's dollar is as good as gold. And then Charles de Gaulle stood up and said, hey, well, then give me gold, give us gold. And this forced nations to take a look at America's spending habit, and that forced Nixon off the gold and silver standard, which we are now living in the direct consequences of a dollar not backed by any sound value. And so they had to go in later in the 70s and find another way to keep the dollar backing. So they come up with this scheme of the petrodollar. And as they did that, we go through the removal of the Glass-Steagall Act in the 80s and 90s and all of this stuff. And now, so telling that this process of imperial collapse is not starting. I think that what we're in now is the state where the snake's head has been cut off. The body is still twitching, and rigor mortis is about to set in. This is why nations are now doing currency swap deals. This is why nations are willing to buck up against the American empire, which they weren't willing to 20 and 30 years ago. This is why America is lagging behind in hypersonic weapons. This is why America no longer has the military edge over China or Russia anymore, and she's not even proven to have a greater military edge over Iran right now because of imperial rot, systemic rot and decline, and a debt burden, the likes which no one has ever heard of, because America is still the greatest and the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, not just in the history of recent history, but in the history of the world, meaning she has more debt than any nation before her. And she has been able to kick the can down the road so long, but now we're at a dead end street, and we're witnessing the fallout from her economic, her political, and her geopolitical ineptitude right now. And I believe that we're in that stage of imperial collapse, because all of the signs are showing that the twitching body, you know how you can cut the head off a snake and the body still twitches and moves and coils for about 2 or 3 hours. I believe we're in that part of the imperial collapse, because you can no longer continue to kick this debt burden down the can and expect for China and Japan and African nations and Latin American nations and your European allies to just continue to take the debt on, especially as resources become more coveted and more limited for the American empire.
Well, I think that the best way I can respond there is to say that if what you say is true, we're bound to see the behavior of China as well as Russia, factionally and then collectively, and as allies, Russia and China, confirm that they are pursuing a strategy that would accelerate the trends you see. That's to say, the decline of the US hegemon. If what you say is what the Chinese leadership believes, if what you say is what the Russian leadership believes, I'm not disagreeing with what you've laid out, Rashid. I'm simply saying, make it operational. Is what you've said as the collapse of the accumulating weakness of the US empire to project its economic power, to cause the rest of the world to finance its debt, is that power weakening? Let's then look not so much to the NATO allies, who've all agreed to refinance US debt and enrich the US with the expansion of their GDP in defense procurements from the United States, to accept US tariff imposition and penalties and so forth. Let's not ask the NATO allies. Their answer is the US empire is not collapsing. We've got a problem with an individual, Donald Trump. That's the European allies. So they don't share your view. Let's ask whether the Chinese leadership shares your view, whether the Russian leadership shares your view. We're too late now to go on with what the Russian side has to say. So let's leave for our audience to consider, because you've got his image up there above your head on the wall behind you. Will President Xi Jinping accept a summit meeting with President Trump on May 14, when Trump says he's going to Beijing? The breaking news today, as it was yesterday, as it was the day before, is the Chinese leadership refused to say they're accepting Trump's visit yet. Why are they saying that? Because they're saying that their view of the damage being done to China by the US war against Iran, by the blockade of Hormuz, is so serious, they expect the US to continue with negotiations, not resume fighting, to resolve the Hormuz Strait regime in a way that benefits the region and Iran. They expect the United States to stop attacking the sovereignty and independence of Iran on all the terms that President Xi's foreign minister, Wang Yi, reiterated when he met with Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi earlier this week. Pardon me. In fact, what we're seeing is China has made a precondition for the US, which it describes as hegemonic, to accept either coexistence with China or Xi will not receive Trump week. And now it's Friday. Friday's over in China. We're already in the weekend. We're coming up for the arrival of the President of the United States in China. And we are at an unprecedented point in which China says we aren't confirming he's going to arrive. Now, why do I use this, pardon me, as an example? Because we don't need, I'm happy to accept what you've said, Rashid, as an analysis of the decline of the US empire. What I am urging us and our audience to ask is that what the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians aim to do right now? We've talked about the Russian side, we've talked a bit about the Iranian side, but there's another empire elephant in this particular China shop and in this room, and that's the Chinese empire. I know a lot of people don't want to accept that China has hegemonic ambitions, and it denies it does too. However, let's consider whether the Chinese view of coexistence with the United States is intent on accelerating the decline of the US empire in order to defend China first. Let's see if that's what happens next. We see a test on whether Trump arrives on May 14 to a red carpet or doesn't arrive because the red carpet's been rolled back. It's a simple little test. It's a test of fact, but it's also a test of whether your outline, Rashid, without disagreeing with it, whether your outline is the Chinese line right now. I don't know yet.
I believe that the Chinese, and I'm not saying that they have some foreknowledge or insight, but by studying human behavior, just like I'm looking at it, and just like you look at it, and everyone else look at it, they understand that America, and this is America's stated policy. So this is not something that I'm guessing about. It's not to allow any nation or combination of nations, right, to rise to near peer or peer power status. So no matter what China is talking about, America's policy, her think tanks, and her establishment will never accept China as a near peer or peer power equal to and willing to split the world up with, because that is the United States stated policy. You can say, well, let's see if China really is trying to what you say is moving towards ignoring America as a global power and moving on to something new. Well, let's look at this little short clip, and we'll right after this short clip we'll discuss it.
China has drawn a hard legal line against American sanctions, and for the first time in history, it has actually enforced it. On Saturday, China's Ministry of Commerce issued its first ever blocking order under its 2021 blocking rules, a legal mechanism designed to neutralize the extraterritorial reach of foreign laws. The order prohibits any Chinese entity from recognizing, enforcing, or complying with US sanctions imposed on 5 Chinese petrochemical companies, all accused of buying Iranian crude oil. The legal basis for China's rules dates back to January 2021, but Saturday marks the first time Beijing has actually issued a concrete prohibition order under them. It is a significant shift from diplomatic protest to active legal countermeasure. So who are the 5 companies at the center of this? They include Hengli Petrochemicals' Dalian refinery and 4 so-called teapot refineries Shandong Jincheng Petrochemical Group, Hebei Xinhai Chemical Group, Shuguang Luqing Petrochemical, and Shandong Shengxing Chemical. Teapot refineries are smaller independent facilities that operate outside China's state-owned oil giants like Sinopec. They account for a quarter of China's total refinery capacity and have long capitalized on heavily discounted crude from sanctioned countries, including Iran, Russia, and Venezuela. The US Treasury's OFAC described Hengli as one of Tehran's most valued customers, alleging it purchased billions of dollars worth of Iranian oil. China, for its part, bought more than 80% of all oil Iran shipped in 2025. Washington's sanctions, imposed under Trump's maximum pressure campaign, placed the 5 companies on the specially designated nationals list, effectively cutting them off from the US financial system and freezing their assets. Beijing's blocking order took effect immediately upon publication, and China's Commerce Ministry stated that the US measures improperly restrict Chinese companies from conducting normal trade activities with third countries in violation of international law. The timing is pointed. Washington and Tehran remain at a diplomatic standstill, with no permanent resolution in sight for the conflict that began with US-Israeli strikes on Iran in late February. China has consistently opposed the war and the accompanying sanctions regime, and Saturday's move signals that Beijing is now willing to use legal tools, not just words, to push back. Whether the blocking order has real-world teeth, given America's grip on the global financial system, remains to be seen. But as a statement of intent, it is the clearest China has made yet.
Well, thanks so much for tuning in to CNBC TV 18. Make sure you follow us and stay updated.
We see that this is the first time that this has happened. The Chinese are telling their companies to ignore U.S. sanctions.
No, wait a minute, Rashid. Wait a minute. They're telling a small fraction of their oil trading operation, their oil refining operation, the teapot segment. They're signaling a statement of intention using a small part of the Chinese trading system in petrochemicals and oil and gas. They have not done so with respect to the Chinese banks. They have not signaled anything comparable to resistance of US sanctions in the Chinese financial system. They have not done so with respect to the major state-owned Chinese oil, gas, and petrochemical companies. There's no doubt that it's an important signal, but the conclusion of this little documentary, which appears to have been an Indian one of some interest, the conclusion is the signal's force remains to be seen. Now, we're running out of time for our discussion today, and we're leaving it where everything remains to be seen. We are seeing China signaling to the United States, pull back. Wang Yi said as much and more when Foreign Minister Arakchi was in Beijing earlier this week. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman has made a subtle, all too subtle, you might say, precondition. Either the US adheres to the negotiating track for the Hormuz, or there's no summit meeting with Xi. That was the message. It's been repeated at the foreign ministry level in an excessively discreet way. Each day for the last 4 days since Arakchi left Beijing, the foreign ministry, Wang Yi, who's more important than a foreign minister, he's a Politburo member of the Communist Party of China. The US correspondents, they've been asking, what can you tell us about the Trump visit? The answer is the US and China are in communication on the visit. We have no further information at this stage. What does that mean? We're not going to say yes to the visit, and we're not going to say no to the visit yet. So just as your documentary, a good presentation, said, the signal is words, the force is legal, but force of arms are what dictate the current crisis and the war against Iran. And Iran's fight back is a force of arms, and it's effective. Will China meet Trump while US is using force in its war? That's the problem for Xi. That's the problem. Is he willing to meet and negotiate with Trump while Trump's at war in a way that China said we won't countenance? Let's wait and see, shall we, Rashid?
Yes, sir, and we'll do this again very soon. I thank you for joining me today again, and thank you for accommodating me. It's getting a little bit bad out here, but thank you so much for accommodating me because you understood what was going on in the background. I really appreciate it, John.
Thank you for having me, Rashid. It's a pleasure to be here. All
right, be safe. Everybody, oh, and I'll send you the video in a second. Everybody, thank you all for joining us on another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. As I often say before I go off the air, I say do right by others, not because there's some material gain to be had or because of some accolades to be had. Do right by others because it's the right, the humane, and the godly thing to do. Because even when no one else is watching you, remember that God Almighty is watching you. As my late, great, and beautiful mother would always say, God sits high on the throne of power, but he looks low at the actions of man. Know that I love each and every one of you who loves truth. But know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that the God of freedom, justice, and equality has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true. But above all things, remember to stay righteous. Hey, mama, your baby boy still loves you more than life. Thank you for everything, Mom. We're out of here.
Told you to walk away. That was my first and last mistake. I'm blue without your face. But what can I do? 'Cause I'm just a sinking ship, and you're just a